Our private conversation, is it?
Naghma, your video is off, so you may want to just switch on your video.
Yeah. So I went back to the mail to check who we're really chatting with. I'm like, this is something not working out right here.
We are live now. It's over to you. Richa, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
We can't hear you. Richa, we can't still hear you.
Of the Global Compact Network India. It is our pleasure to have you all at this juncture. The fact that you're with us underlines your commitment to sustainable development and recognition to upgrade Indian efforts to realize the SDG ambition. This platform provides excellent opportunity to deliberate, brainstorm, discuss, and explore the way forward to fill in the gaps for achieving the SDG goals. We have an eminent panel of guests who are leaders in their respective fields. A very warm welcome to all our guests. With this, I would like to open the concurrent session part 2. We have a starred panel with us to discuss a self-reliant and sustainable India, which is a very pertinent issue for all of us. I would like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Mr. Srikrishna Sridhar Murthy, co-founder and CEO Sattva Consulting. He's leading the discussion with an outstanding panel. Let me introduce the panel before we hand it over to Mr. Murthy. We have with us on the panel Ms. Naghma Mulla, President and CEO Edelgive Foundation, Ms. Roshika Singh, Senior Country Officer, India ISP. We also have with us Ms. Nandita Baruah, Country Representative, India, the Asia Foundation. Also on the panel, we have Mr. Sundeep Singh, Principal Director, Accenture Strategy. And also we have Dr. Randeep Guleria, Director, All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Over to you, Mr. Murthy.
Thanks a lot, Richard. A very, very warm welcome to all my co-panelists and everybody who's listening. It's been almost 10 months into the pandemic now, and I hope everybody is doing safe and healthy. And I think this was also a time where we all had to go back and bring in newer energies to get through the various kinds of difficulties we went through, be it from healthcare perspective or an economic perspective. And it's our firm belief that I think this only made us stronger as individuals, as communities, and hopefully as a country. And we're probably coming out of this as a much stronger, ecosystem. And I now invite all my panelists to help us walk through in what ways we as a country are getting more and more sustainable and more self-reliant and stronger, as an ecosystem. Maybe I'll start off, Dr. Guleria, with your thoughts first. Has India, from a healthcare ecosystem, got stronger? Has the pandemic made us stronger? What forms of or what aspects of our healthcare do you think got tested, and how have we come out of it stronger?
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. First of all, I think the last 1 year has been sort of very important as far as the health care and health infrastructure is concerned. It probably put healthcare at the center stage. Health was not at the center stage as far as our economy and wealth was concerned for a long period of time. In this actually not during the pandemic, and we also realized that health plays a very important role as far as the economy is concerned, whether it be the development of infrastructure, whether it be other sectors, tourism, all of them because of the pandemic. It also changed our approach when investment became much more, and we started looking at it as a sector for investment to drive the economy and take development forward rather than something that was more like a social sector. And we started off in the beginning when there was a shortage of what we needed in terms of, let's say, the personal protection equipment, N95 masks. There was the issue of shortage of ventilators. But India became more and more resilient. We sort of moved out of our silos, and a lot of individuals in different sectors, engineering sector, manufacturing sector, the health sector, came together to really start developing products. And India started manufacturing PPEs, and now we are actually exporting PPEs. There was a shortage of N95 masks. We were able to make N95 masks by the manufacturing sector, the garment sector came forward, and now we are actually in a position where N95 masks are also being exported. We were reading at that point in time that there would be shortage of ventilators. There was shortage of ventilators in Italy and Spain, but in our setup, we were able to really come through and have ventilators available by a lot of industries which are not involved in making ventilators come forward, and that really helped us a lot. The other major development that I think happened was that India was known as far as it was known as let's say, the world's pharmacy. We were producing a lot of generic products in terms of drugs, but we were not doing a lot of R&D. The research and development was not that much. That changed a lot with the vaccines. India has actually really now moved very much ahead, not only in manufacturing vaccines, but doing basic research. And now we have, with international collaborations, research going on more than 5, or I would say almost 7 platforms of different vaccines which we can make for COVID-19. We have the Serum Institute of India, we have Zydus, which is making a new DNA vaccine. We have biologically, we have Dr. Reddy's laboratory. So there has been a lot of development in terms of R&D, which was not our strength in the past. We were more in making generic products, and that has also changed a lot. I think ultimately lessons that we've learned is health has to be given its due importance. Health has to be looked at as an investment rather than just as a social sector, and we have to move out of silos. I keep arguing that if we had done all of this in a non-pandemic situation, our economy would have done much better. All the things that we got together in a pandemic showed that we have the capacity to do it, but have never done it in the past. So I hope that what we've learned in the last 1 year or so, we are able to take that forward into building a more resilient, building a more developed country in terms of health and other sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guleria, and what a lesson to learn, as well. We learned it quite, quickly and strongly, but what an important lesson to learn, to put health at the center stage of the entire, story of growth. And it's also, interesting that you bring up the fact that we always had this capability. It was really the change in our approach, the mindset, and also amazed at the speed at which we were able to bring the capabilities, to the forefront as well. So I think that's absolutely wonderful to hear. Just kind of moving to the ecosystem of corporates, Naghma, if you were to kind of come in, it was an interesting time early on, when the pandemic hit, and lots of corporates and the social impact ecosystem kind of jumped in. There were lots of corporates manufacturing sanitizers, using their manufacturing facilities. Masks was an example Dr. Guleria just gave. We had many people coming in and putting out the masks and other material using their garment facilities, and the NGO sector really stepped up in many different ways. Can you walk us through how the pandemic kind of brought this ecosystem together? How did the roles change? What did we learn? And are there learnings that we can now take forward?
Yeah, no, thank you, Krishna, and I'm so glad you're asking me the question that I'm trying to answer. Really, it is because it is something we must remember as we build forward. And I go back to the last few days of March when the lockdown was announced, and I remember one morning just hearing from one of the NGOs, Koro, in Bombay, saying that there is people are starving, and we are mobilizing our teams to source funds and also source material and deliver. Now, this is an NGO that works on women's rights, all right? And this was, they realized that this is not even, March is not even over. And I hear it, and that's when I realized that this is going to be the first of the many that will come. But to see that within 48 hours, this organization that has nothing to do with sourcing materials, deploying supplies, packaging, not only managed to create an entire, delivery model, but also negotiate with the DMART, to speak to funders. That's where I watched this whole process, where over a matter of 2 days, supplies were in the homes of people. And as that started, you saw the entire ecosystem, development sector ecosystem, actually modify and adapt to this first need, which is people must not starve. And that was phenomenal. That also has to be something we remember about the development sector in India, that it is agile. It is actually very, very adaptable, and it can adapt to the emergency needs that are coming up. Simultaneously, what happened is, for the first time in my, almost a decade, I saw the corporate sector not only coming with intent. See, I really think people do have the right intent most of the times, but adapting their own processes, making everything urgent and important, making decisions in record times, deploying, trusting organizations. We just advised. I mean, I think over 10 days we could actually help almost 25 NGOs across the country access around $3 million, and that's not mean compared, especially when you think it is 24 Pargana, Alwar, Jharkhand mein NGO hai. These are not organizations that can access it, but people wanted to trust and adapt. So I think the corporate sector as well as the development sector have a lot to be proud of in what happened there. And I'll give you a third example of how the communities adapted, which for me is probably even more remarkable, where the NGOs very soon realized that this is not going to work for long term, but the problem will stay long term, right? So the ones who actually went back to the communities and said, we need help. So youth forums, youth groups got mobilized, women's groups got mobilized. There is again a phenomenal NGO called Ibtida in Alwar that put women together. Women created grain banks. Said everybody who's got grains will pool together and we will make equitable distribution. Like, this is brilliant. There's an NGO in Calcutta where youth mobilized. Youth would go to the ration shops and actually sit there and ensure everyone got equitable ration, not equal ration. And this is something that I've watched all the three important stakeholders of the development sector really rising to the challenge. And I will speak more to it, but this is the context I'm giving you, that I think we have a lot to be proud about in how we've gone through the last few months, and a lot to learn so that we build forward, because this worked on energy, on grit, on determination, but long-term sustainability will take a lot more.
Wonderful, and that's an important point, Naghma. We will come back to on how do we kind of keep this going. But again, I think it was amazing to see a lot of things coming center stage. Suddenly the groups that were not so critical suddenly became critical. Organizations that were knocking on the doors were now being chased. It was suddenly a flipping of roles that started to happen across the board, and I think that's something we should see. How we can then leverage and go to the next level. Roshika, if I were to now come, to the perspective of someone like an IFC, with obviously, dual mandates, saying, there is development that's important, but you're also an investor, and you have a multi-sectoral view, of the whole thing, and you have a more broader macro view of this. What, from both the development and market perspective, and across your own portfolios, how did you see things change, and how did people adapt, to the pandemic?
No, thank you. I think, so I do share your optimism in terms of recovery. I mean, as we all know, India had one of the most stringent lockdowns for good reason, and we saw GDP contractions. But now when we're looking at the IMF predictions of India's GDP of double digits, over 11%, I think recovery has been much quicker than expected. So I think, the numbers are there to show from a market perspective that there is reason for optimism. I think building on some of Naghma's comments around the private sector, stepping up, corporates playing a role, I think we've really seen that. And it's actually one of the first times that we've seen the government and private sector really coming together to realize they have a shared objective. We've seen the government reach out to the private sector and, being genuinely open to playing a role in working through the pandemic from a health perspective, from a supply chain perspective, and more. We recently in December, we co-hosted a roundtable with the Department of Pharmaceuticals, to present how can we actually bring investment to this sector, to medical device developers, to the pharma sector. And I think it's been well received. I think just 2 or 3, highlights that I'll share with you in terms of looking at what we've seen from our portfolio. We've seen quite a lot of innovation in the digital space. And I think there's 2 examples I'd like to share. One is in the pharma space. We recently invested in a company called 1MG that is an online pharmaceutical company. And this, during the pandemic, with concerns of going into shops and so forth, they saw their growth, their demand actually spiked over 440%. It was significant. And they really built on this by, just on top of offering pharmacy deliveries, building in diagnostics, building in telemedicine. So really an opportunity to leverage and move forward. These companies didn't stop at what they were doing. They thought differently about how they adapt. I think even in the education space, Baiju, one of our investee companies as well, saw something like 20 million new users take on their curriculum. And these 70% of those were in non-tier 1 cities. So I think, for IFC, we do care about the development impact as well of all our investments. So I think that's important. Again, looking at the health sector, we actually had 2 facilities within COVID. One was a rapid fast-track one where we really stepped in to support existing clients with working capital constraints. And we saw this across the board, whether it was health, whether it was solar power, the ability to be able to pay your employees. During the pandemic, it was very difficult, and we offer that kind of financial help across the board to all sectors. And I can share a few more examples of those companies, including, I think Dula Dairy most recently. So across the sector, solar, dairy, agri. And I think as well, the vaccine development, the pharma, of course, front and center. We've recently invested in BioWe, a vaccine manufacturer, and I think we'll see more and more of that. I think the last point I wanted to share is also building on Dr. Guleria's points about health becoming front and center. We've thought about health in a different way, and I think we've all learned how broad that definition of health is. IFC also has a global health platform where we committed $4 billion globally to bring support towards private sector investment in emerging market developing countries in the sector. And that, again, it didn't just mean medicine or hospitals or diagnostics. It meant PPE kits, it meant masks, it meant the development, having these markets be able to develop these sort of products. So I think we've also seen, I think, logistics and supply chain. It's been incredibly important. And I think with vaccine rollout, the cold chain will play a huge example, not an example, will be a critical player in this. One of our investee companies, again, Indospace, is recently tied up with Culex, and they're looking to create a supply chain in the cold chain area specifically for vaccine rollout. So I think bringing in logistics and supply chain into our definition of health has been something new that we've learned as well. So I'll stop there. And also, I just wanted to say, really delighted to be here, and thank you to the organizers for having me.
No, thank you so much, Roshika. I think 2-3 things that you mentioned are really, really critical. One, the digital piece, the adaptation of everybody from a digital perspective, I think was very, very critical. Given the way we all lived and worked, over the last many months. and continued investments in healthcare. The commitment of billions of dollars coming into healthcare from various global quarters, and logistics, which suddenly became such an important element, because everything had to be kind of brought into where people were. I think that ecosystem, from an infrastructure point of view, again. We probably should have done it much earlier on, but again, we brought in a lot more pieces as an ecosystem together to kind of make that happen. And the role of government in partnering with these organizations, the companies, and supporting them, which I think was also a very, very critical play. So we will come back to you with more in terms of some of the questions on what or how this is kind of going to move forward, and what structural changes we can make for that. But Sundeep, probably switching more on the market side, it'll be great to hear from you on were there sectors that have been more kind of robust, sustainable through these pandemic times, and how would you look at the various sectors, especially when it comes to things around the two SDGs that we're specifically talking about, which is decent work and economic growth, and infrastructure, innovation, all of these things. What sectors kind of played out how?
Sure. No, I think first of all, thanks a lot for having me here. I think we have touched a little bit upon the logistics and health part of it, but if I were to just take a step back for a minute, if you really think about what this pandemic has done, quite clearly it was unprecedented. There was absolutely no precedence, and there wasn't a way for any one of us to be prepared about what was coming ahead. And the impact was felt across all dimensions. It was to begin with a health disaster, but its impact was felt across the dimensions of economic, environment, social. If I were to just touch upon one of these very quickly, let's say for economic, we clearly know that the country has been growing at a rate of about 3 to 4, sometimes 5 percentage points on a year-on-year basis. But the predictions for this fiscal is about a -7 to 8% contraction. So that's the economic impact. If we think about the environment impact, we saw a few months immediately following the pandemic beginning that we were seeing something like 150 tons per day of additional biomedical waste on a daily basis, which was significantly above the usual number of about 550. So 550 tons per day, what was the number that used to be, but immediately following the pandemic, we saw something like a 700, which was a big jump. And quite clearly on the social front, we have seen significant impact. Over 100 million people are feared to have slipped below the poverty line. There has been a rise in the mental illness. My sources tell me that it's about 20% rise in the mental illness, about 27% rise in domestic violence. So I think this just gives us a breadth of the pandemic in terms of how it has really impacted various facets of life. Now turning our attention to the point, Mr. Srikrishna, that you called out, which sectors were better prepared to respond to this kind of a pandemic. I think a few things have emerged out. If you really think through what are the different nuances which have stood out in terms of the gaps or the opportunity areas for the business sector to respond to, I think the first one was really about the readiness of our business models. There was an over-reliance on the bricks and mortar kind of business models. While some of the bigger players may have been comfortable with the digital and the virtual ways of working and the remote working models and the cloud platform kind of infrastructure, but at large, if you look at the corporate sector at large, there was a level of gap which had to be addressed. If we just talk about the MSME sector, it saw the earnings diminish by about 35% immediately after the COVID kind of kicked in. So that was one big gap. If we think about the supply chain resilience, quite clearly sectors such as auto, pharma, electronics were the first ones to be impacted because the travel was constrained, the supply chains were disrupted, there were liquidity crunches. If we just talk about, let's say, the auto sector, on a daily basis, we were seeing losses of about 2,300 crores for India as an auto sector. The real estate, for example, saw a lot of drop. There was almost about 30% drop in the residential sales. Now, what does it all mean? I mean, as I said, nobody could have been prepared for this. But I think what we have seen is that there was an immediate response, which was the months leading, 2 to 3 months leading to the start of the COVID pandemic, and then a little more medium-term response where the stakeholders kind of kind of responded, got their act together, they reimagined their business models, they invested in the right kind of capabilities. And that's where I think what has really emerged out is two things. One, digitization is a big thing. We have seen that a lot of companies are now adapting their business models to more digital infrastructures. There is a migration to cloud kind of a wave that we are seeing in the market. So that's one big thing. Even if we talk about the MSME sector, the RBI statistics tell us that there is almost 100 million transactions, digital transactions taking place on a daily basis, which is a significant jump from where we were pre-COVID days. And the second big thing that we have seen is the growing emphasis on resilient infrastructure. And it's evident in some of the recent budget allocations and the way the government has framed its policies, the entire Atmanirbhar campaign. Almost 111 lakh crore rupees has been earmarked for capex in national infrastructure in the recently announced budget. So I think those are some of the reflections that we have seen in terms of which sectors have been impacted and how they have tried to reimagine their business models to be able to cope up with the challenges that have come along. So those are some initial thoughts. I'll be very happy to share more as we move along, but just some initial thoughts to get us started.
Fantastic, Sundeep. Thank you again so much for that. The whole adaptation from a business model, which is a really fundamental thinking about how the business should happen, so that was what was kind of challenged and questioned, and people had to kind of go back not to their sales strategy or not to their marketing strategy, but actually go back to the fundamentals of who we are and how you would kind of thrive in this ecosystem. But I think you also brought up a very important thing about the larger impact that it had on on the numbers that you shared about mental health or the number of people that may have gone back to poverty because of this. So Nandita, this is the reason I kept you for the end. I wanted to bring you in towards the end to talk about how much of all of this self-reliance, sustainability and adaptation actually has trickled down to the grassroots ecosystem, the more vulnerable populations in India. And have there been people who were on their path of self-reliance and now pulled back, on their path for sustainability, on their path for empowerment, now pulled back? What's happened at the grassroots level?
Thank you, Krishna. And I think, a lot has been said by my previous speakers. And rightfully, I think we've seen a lot of things that probably we wouldn't have imagined a year back would have been possible, even in terms of the way we have adapted to work, adapted to the economic challenges. But at the same time, I think we ought not to forget that prior to the pandemic also, society at large had a major handicap in terms of equity, whether we talk about equity in terms of gender or whether we talk about equity in terms of economics. So there has been this inequitable existence, which, as we saw initially, right at the beginning, when the lockdown happened, the complete chaos that created to the labor sector, the exodus that started happening, we had to come to terms with it. We had to grapple with it, figure out how to handle it. Rightfully, again, as said by the other speakers, society as a collective whole came together to try and find solutions to that, whether it was the civil society, the private sector, institutions, food banks. But what it did show was the inequity and the level of vulnerability that exists, when we fall into a crisis, and how the differential impact is there. Now, how much of that has changed? We are reviving, okay? Like in rural India, most interestingly was that the immediate massive health impact of COVID or the infection expenditure of COVID was something that was a little slow to take up in rural India. And I think when the people started moving, there was this feeling that everybody's bringing it from the towns to rural India. The breakdown of the healthcare or the non-existent healthcare system got people really starting to think about what can rural India do to further ramp up its own ability to support healthcare within the rural community. Innovations happened there. Civil society groups came in, medical, things that were unthinkable in parts of India. I was saying online healthcare were made available even to many of the grassroots, right down to the grassroots. And it needed a conduit. It didn't happen on its own. The conduits were either the partnership with civil society, private sector, or smaller and bigger healthcare institutions. So some of that, I think we saw that it's something that needed behavior change. It's something that needed a structure for it to happen, did happen. However, the concern going forward is that, and I think it's actually the concerns and the aim to address it is well captured in the union budget that the finance minister put in. When the finance minister said that the Sankalp for Atmanirbhar Bharat is on 6 pillars, right? And she talked about healthcare well-being as one, physical capital infrastructure, which we all agree. But also the two that stand out is healthcare well-being and inclusive development for aspiration in India. These are two critical things that we have to now focus if we want to see the changes and the adaptations that came about because of the COVID, for it to trickle down and be beneficial both socially and economically to rural India. My concern here is also that we are moving very fast on a digital or a digitized way of working, whether it's digital economic platforms, digital platforms for education. The challenge would be to ensure that the digital divide between rural and urban India is also adequately addressed, so that rural India is not left behind in this new normal or new way of working, or whatever we like to call it, and we don't face the same consequences that we faced when the pandemics first hit us. And we went global about saying, look at the labor crisis in India, look at the people suffering. I think it's a lesson learned. It's to say, the more we can invest to reduce the divide of access, of resources, of technology, of finance between urban and rural sectors, between genders, it's going to be important. I do want to make another point, though. I think we have to be very, very cognizant of the differential impact of this entire pandemic and moving forward on women. There is the existent handicap of patriarchy, nobody can deny it. But we also have an opportunity here, I think, where women can really play a very, very strong and equitable role in moving this economic growth forward, either in urban or rural. I think, and that investment has to be consciously made. Affirmative actions have to be consciously targeted towards those. Just to give an example, I think maybe Sundeep spoke about it before, was on the gig economy, or one of the other speakers spoke about it. The gig economy had a lot of women in it. It was booming, right? It was massive. And then when the pandemic happened, the sectors in which women were involved in were the ones to completely fall by the side, because those required face-to-face interaction, grooming, healthcare, beauty, physical training. All of those fell apart. And their ability to jump back took a much longer time. There were companies who had to take proactive action to help that happen. There was also the very visible fact that access to certain, support system, which was absent for women, also made it difficult for them to move from one gig platform to the other. So men who were in, say, the urban company kind of a platform, could move to an Amazon platform to just do delivery, because they had a motorcycle, because they could ride a scooty, and they had access to those. Women didn't. So I think for us, it's also interesting, and we are examining this now, how much of the stimulus package that has gone out, and how much of the current financial packages that are going out are actually going to have a very, very well analyzed gender impetus built into it. And if you talk about trickle down, the trickle down on gender is much more needed in rural India as in urban India. It's not just an urban thing. So I think these things are important. There has been adaptation, just like in rural sectors, of people adapting, becoming a part of an ecosystem to produce local products, be it masks, be it soaps, be it sanitizers. Yes, but it needs to be sustained with more mainstream economic goods and products that we will be doing going forward. And that's my appeal, saying that has to be absolutely kept in mind. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful. Nandita, thanks for bringing that up, on how, for us to be self-reliant and sustainable, reducing the divide and, is very, very important. Be it the digital divide, be it any form of divide that we're kind of, today facing. I think reducing that is really very fundamental for us to, be self-reliant and sustainable as a country. And just having the solutions won't help. We need to be able to do this, at a much more, equitable kind of a model. Probably, Dr. Guleria, if we were to kind of now, bring you in and talk about how do we, kind of reduce this divide in India from a healthcare perspective? Healthcare is coming center stage, but how do we do it from a public health ecosystem going forward, and so that it's not, it's not just for the middle class or the upper middle class or the rich, but everybody in India, and where is India's healthcare ecosystem headed from that perspective?
So I totally agree that we really need to work aggressively as far as the healthcare divide is concerned in the health sector. As we look at the let's say the private sector and the public sector, there's a huge divide in terms of the out-of-pocket expenditure that happens. And because of the out-of-pocket expenditure that happens, there is a huge pressure on the public sector, which has not been developed in the manner it should be. And therefore, it has created a huge issues. And there is also a gender divide, which has already been mentioned. And I'd just like to add on to that, even in the pre-pandemic era, we looked at our data and we really found that when it looks at patients coming to even AIIMS New Delhi, the further you were away from AIIMS, the lesser the number of women who were reporting into our OPD, which suggested that if you were having a health-seeking behavior and you were living, say, 500 kilometers away, it was likely that men would come for a sickness that they needed to come to a hospital like AIIMS. Women would not be able to come for multiple reasons, and therefore there was a lack of equity. And we felt that we have to develop strategies to reach out to the people who need healthcare at their own site rather than they having to come so far off, because that inequality will persist if we have distances as far as our society is concerned. And that will also happen when we start moving more and more toward a digital health platform. We started looking at, during the pandemic and during the lockdown, a lot of telemedicine, teleconsultation. And this was something which really became the sort of mantra that you could really, patients didn't have to come to the hospital. They could have consultations while they were at home, and you could really have follow-up of your patients with hypertension, diabetes, chronic respiratory diseases, a large number of non-communicable diseases. Patients could be followed up, and their medicines could be adjusted based on telehealth and telemedicine. But again, we need to understand that a large number of our population may not have access to the telehealth and teleconsultation that we're talking of. They may not even have a smartphone. And therefore, to be able to reach out to them in an equitable manner becomes a huge challenge. That is number one. The second, of course, is that we need to develop a system that there is sort of some degree of assurance or security for those in the lower middle class or below that, so that they have, we have that in the form of Ayushman Bharat, but we need to really develop that in a big manner so that it becomes more and more inclusive. Sometimes Ayushman Bharat doesn't cover the middle class. There are sort of the gaps in that thing. And if one of their family members gets admitted to a corporate hospital, the average per day bill in the ICU is more than 1 lakh rupees a day. And you can't afford that for any person if he's in the ICU for, let's say, 2 weeks or so. And we've seen number of patients who actually we've shifted to our hospital because they just don't have the money to pay the bills. So we really need to develop a strategy where we can look at health as something of a social responsibility, so that we are able to provide equitable health to everyone, no matter what be his socioeconomic status, gender, or the place that the person comes from. That is the challenge, I think, that we have. And this pandemic has shown us that health is very, very important. If you don't have a country where health is given the center stage, it will affect various sectors of the economy. And therefore, we need to work in an aggressive manner to be able to provide equitable health across the country, both in urban and rural area. It's a huge challenge. We've been really not addressing it for, I would say, decades. And we would see areas where let's say, primary health centers are really not functional. And there are differentials also. And therefore, if you look at what happens in, say, parts of some states, like states in the south, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, they have a good health system because they've invested in that. But many states in central and north India are really in the doldrums as far as health in rural India is concerned. And I sometimes wonder whether health should become part of the concurrent list and it should become part of a central responsibility rather than a state responsibility. It's a very dramatic statement to make because currently health is a state subject, it's not a central subject. But there's such a lot of diversity that one saw. And one also saw that during the pandemic, when a lot of things were taken up by the center, whether it be testing, whether it be the vaccine distribution, a better job was done. It would have been a problem if there was less coordination. So this is some sort of a challenging thing that I think we need to really rethink our health system, especially the public health system. And I also think there has to be a lot of focus on preventive health. There is a lot of things that we can do where we can decrease the burden of disease just by focusing on preventive health, which goes beyond just the health sector. Sanitation, clean drinking water, all of this will have a huge impact when it comes to communicable diseases, good behavior in terms of cough etiquettes, other infection control measures. All of this was given a big boost during the pandemic, but to sustain it subsequently is the challenge so that we are able to have a society which is healthy, which is able to take measures to prevent disease rather than having to come to the hospital because of the disease that they have. So, things like tobacco use, a huge thing in our country. In various parts of India, tobacco consumption is considered part of the norm. It's sort of thought to be culturally right. How do we change that? Smoking is another issue. We have more than 10 cancers which are related to smoking. So there has to be a lot of thrust in preventive health also, which we've not done for a long time. So I think many things have been sort of come to light during the pandemic. The challenge is how do we really sustain it and provide healthcare which is equitable both to urban and rural India and doesn't lead to a large number of people going below the poverty line just to pay their health bills. That is a big challenge that we have.
Absolutely, Dr. Guleria, and I think definitely, the right time to make dramatic statements, no question at all. I think the way, hopefully, India managed the center-state thing better than some of the other countries that we saw, at least, as observers. But I think the point of preventive health, I think, is a very classic one. I think it's really extremely important for us. If we were to look at self-reliance, from that perspective, being more proactive than reactive will only help. There's no way we can actually expect the growth rates that we want as a country or development if you're not focusing on preventive health. And Roshika, there's probably now, if I want to just pass this on, that particular thought to you, and say, preventive health is a philosophy. Can we do something in advance to be able to not let this happen? And similarly, in other sectors, it could be infrastructure, it could be the way we also look at work, or working conditions, livelihoods. The entire, definition of those could change. Is there from somebody like an IFC or in your investment circles, is there a leapfrogging in thinking of what should we invest next in? Right.
No, I think absolutely. So I think, looking at the health sector, and I think these are very important points where we are seeing people falling below the poverty line simply because of healthcare bills. So preventive care has a role to play in that, but health insurance as well. We do not have that level of health insurance that we see in other countries, the recognition, the understanding of it, particularly outside of tier 1 cities. So I think, for us as well, this is definitely a sector that we are looking at more. I think, globally, there's a lot more conversations around health insurance at that level. And looking at, the SDG work we're focusing on is focused on equity, on decent work. I think, two important aspects that have really been brought up, and I thank Nandita for bringing up the gender point. I think that is absolutely critical. We do know that the women in the labor force in India has, consistently been particularly low. I think it was 21%, unexplainable in a sense. And there is no question that women have been really severely impacted during COVID. We've seen studies from UN Women where we've seen the increased violence and gender-based violence at home to women during the pandemic time. We've seen the burden of uncare work, disproportionately on women historically, and that has been exacerbated in the pandemic as well. So I think really looking at how can we look at supporting women being able to work, having the ability to go back to work. IFC has always championed the cause of employer-supported childcare. There have been some very forward-looking policies that have come out of the Indian government, the Ministry of Labour, to encourage corporates to play a role in this. So it's not only the home, but it is employers to be very forward-looking at offering flexi work, offering paternity leave, introducing that men and women have a role to play in childcare. I remember looking at numbers before the pandemic of the amount of time that women spend on home care. I think globally is 4 times as much as men. In India, it was 10 times as much. So this is really a critical area that I think we need to look at. How can we support women to give them the flexibility? Otherwise, they sleep less, they have less time. It doesn't mean they don't do it, but their health will be impacted, their mental health, their physical health. So I think I would like to flag the gender dimension of this as being critical as we move forward. And really looking at, equity, I think PPPs, public-private partnerships have an incredibly important role to play at a state level, at a municipal level, at an industry level. We do have a PPP team who even now is engaged in working, supporting a hospital in Bihar, actually. So again, being able, I think groups like IFC and other development finance institutions can really look at providing instruments to mobilize and crowd in other investment. It doesn't mean we have to do it, but if we can create the instrument to be able to mobilize that, that's extremely important. And I think we all recognize that, and we recognize our role even at a state level. So that is something we are looking at. We have a cities group that is focusing more and more at working at a municipal level across India. Whether it's having a carbon neutral vision, whether it's having greater healthcare, but how can we support state level governments as well in this? And I think one other important aspect that has been touched upon, the MSME sector. I mean, this is incredibly important. The MSME sector is really the backbone of India. And I think Sundeep mentioned the statistic of 35%. Less investment. And MSMEs have always told us that their biggest obstacle has always been access to finance. I mean, MSMEs, women-owned SMEs in particular, have even larger impediments to being able to reach the financial institutions and being able to get the sort of finance they need to grow and to create supply chains needed. So I think this is something I'd really like to flag. And as IFC and the World Bank Group, actually, we are absolutely committed to supporting the sector. We work with financial institutions, our investments to banks, to NBFCs have lines of credit for this. But I think to highlight 2 aspects, in the last year, with our colleagues at the World Bank Group, we signed a 750 million development policy operation to the government of India, particularly to support the MSME sector in India. And we are now working on a second program, it's called the RAP program, raising and accelerating productivity for MSMEs, which is another $500 million program that we are working through the government on raising access, raising not only just finance, but being able to equip SMEs with what we call non-financial services as well. Information on how to run a business, how to not be so reliant on your accountant, understand your balance sheet, understand how you link to supply chains, how you reach larger buyers. So in a nutshell, I think MSME sector remains front and central to the IFC and absolutely critical to India growing more equitably.
Absolutely. So very important, Roshika. Again, 2-3 things that I'm picking up from what you're saying is the building of the capacity of more vulnerable ecosystems is important, be it financial capacity, digital capacity of ecosystems like MSMEs, gig workers, gender, all of these places, so that you're able to kind of strengthen the ecosystem. So investments are not just in direct businesses, but also in capacity building, kind of businesses which can strengthen the ecosystem. And I think that's a wonderful thought. And also almost like creating a platform and getting co-funding and other funders to kind of come in as well, which is definitely something for us to, we've been talking about collaborations and partnerships a lot, in the ecosystem, but seeing that happen, is also very, very interesting. And that, what you're saying is that's potentially a way forward for all of us, kind of to think about. Naghma, for you to kind of now, add in and say, how is the philanthropy ecosystem and the social impact organization ecosystem responding to the newer models? I mean, are we changing the models? Are we now investing in other things? Are we, as both NGOs, are we looking at building newer solutions, and as philanthropists, are we looking to invest in newer things?
Yeah. First, I want to copy paste a lot of what Roshika has said to the sector. I think a healthy ecosystem, whether it's philanthropy or business, actually looks the same. You respect people for what they bring to the table. You give them some oxygen to operate, and you ensure it comes with some good capital. And I think in the philanthropic ecosystem, we have a lot of that to work on. I did speak about the fantastic trust-based philanthropy that really worked in the last 6 months. For us to be a sustainable and stronger ecosystem going forward, we've got to build from there. Some of the things that were not the most ideal was that while decision making was very, very quick, the funding for the programs that were already there, long-term programs, did come down. Budgets for the business as usual did come down. Operating budgets came down, which means that oxygen in an ecosystem is getting lesser and lesser, and program funding is coming higher. And we've got to look a little at that. The great thing that also happened in the last 6 months is it was the different stakeholders trusted the other for what their capacities are. The corporate sector trusted the development sector also gave back the trust. What we've got to do is not go back to what we were before, which is, everybody's the expert of everything. We cannot make this a service delivery. I think I'm very, very worried about that. It cannot, going forward, we've got to resist from pulling that piece forward, that here is my budget and you are the NGO and let's go and deploy it and give me the success matrix. I wish, and we're working really hard on it, Krishna, that this does not become a habit that pursues. And so I know what shouldn't happen much clearer than what should, and that is the truth. What we've seen come out well are models such as the Migrant Resilience Collaborative, which you are also aware of, where grassroots organizations really came together and said, all right, we think this is the way to address the distress that migrants are going to suffer and are already suffering. And can we look at different stakeholders? Now, that is a model that for me is a very progressive model where every stakeholder knows their expertise, they know their importance in the scheme of things, and they come to strengthen with that importance. There is a clear demarcation on who will advise on what. It's a really refreshing discussion to be a part of, because we're all saying, all right, this is my expertise and that is yours, and we will worry about what we are in charge of. And that gives me a lot of hope that in future, if we really want to address the large-scale problems that have just been exposed, really, they were, I think, always there, but they were really exposed, then we probably will need to have more models like that. And MRC and the scale at which it's happening is giving me hope that we will have some models of this kind to replicate. Also, some great things that happen, funders such as Godrej, for example, industry leaders did not hesitate to go to an NGO and say, this is our mission. We don't know how to do it. Will you help guide us? And they didn't just do that. They also announced it. In fact, they've been very candid that the solution came from a Jan Sahas, for example. And again, that's very refreshing that a corporate or an entity is not like all smarts all by itself. When we demonstrate this good behavior, we are setting a very good, robust path for future collaborative building. Another good thing that has happened is, for the first time, collaboration is a little more real. Instead of conversations, instead of brainstorming, there is some actionable collaboration that we are seeing. Again, can we as a sector, I would be delighted if as a sector we can think of reducing costs of collaboration by really seriously collaborating. I think we spend more on the admin costs in deploying the funds than in really running the structures. That is something, again, through some of the projects that I'm part of, I'm seeing it bodes well. but we'll need many to come together and say, all right, let's trust each other. Let's put logic at the center of it. Let's be in reasonable control on everything, and let's allow experts to operate from their positions of expertise. That is something that I'm seeing in small spurts and builds. And the parting line is really, I hope this does not become a service delivery sector where somebody knows what to do and somebody knows how to do it, and we're just kind of parting in. That's what I think we should definitely be worried about.
No, I mean, and that's a classic one, Naghma, because when you are in the self-delivery, service delivery mode, you're making organizations, communities dependent and not self-reliant, and that's the biggest problem today, right? In the sector, that there is so much of reliance on others in the social impact space.
Yes.
That for you to kind of become self-reliant as an ecosystem is very hard, and I think what you're really saying is that has to stop. For us to have a vibrant ecosystem that can bring in the solutions, mindset of social organizations, philanthropists, social organizations to become self-reliant, and philanthropists to support that, and say, let's partner and work together. I think
yes. And we have to understand philanthropy, development. This is, the genesis is risk, right? We can't really be risk-free, no matter how many metrics we put there. And if we just recognize that, we'll all be a little liberated in the decisions that we make. This whole thing that I need 20 metrics so that my learning outcomes or my health indicators are top notch. Great ambition, but we've got to be realistic about these things. And this is the one sector in the world that actually can embrace risk and fund risk and be okay with it. So I think we should work a lot on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And Nandita, if I were to just extend this conversation, and you talked about among the 6 pillars, during the budget that was spoken about as well, one of them being the inclusive development bit. What kind of, social infrastructure do you think we should now start to build, learning from the pandemic, that helps us go in the direction of, self-reliance at various levels of the ecosystem?
I think I completely actually endorse what Naghma just said about we need to really turn our own thinking on its head, right? As development sector supporters, whether we are looking, and we are sitting in a UN platform with multi-stakeholders. I myself belong to a foundation which funds. The critical question for us, I think, which is a learning we probably should take very seriously now, is to say, who did the thinking and who did the implementation? Where did the ideas come from? And if we are willing to embrace, rightfully, what Naghma said, that we take the ideas and the thinking from those who we need to work with rather than implant them on them and then expect them to do it, we will be able to do away with the matrices. The reason we are constantly trying to monitor is that we are ourselves sometimes unsure of whether this thinking is going to really bring in the equity or the equal distribution of participation, because it's most of the time, and I'm putting myself out there probably to be really bashed by my other development sector colleagues, is that we rarely develop programs which have germinated from the communities we want to work with. It's an analysis we are doing from here, and we're like, oh, this is needed, and therefore we need to start supporting them, rather than saying, can we sit down and discuss what is it that women need? What is it that marginalized communities need from their perspective? It may not be what you and I might be thinking right now, right? And I know that we talked about, let me just give you an example. I think one of the very interesting things that happened during the pandemic was we all decided to work from home, and we put a work from home policy for everybody, right? In my organization alone, I think I had many of my colleagues across and partner organizations where when the work from home was a little relaxed and started opening up, majority of the women actually came and said, I want to get back to it. Okay, I don't want to work from home because I am doing 3 people's work, and everybody who used to think of me as a working person is no longer thinking of me as a working person, even though I am a working person. Yeah, I need to get back into that space at whatever risks it is to me. Yeah. And then the thing is, institutionally, we have to then think ourselves and prepare, how am I going to balance that return in a way that I accept what this person is saying, I hear her, and yet I reduce her risks to exposure that may happen because of the pandemic still being around. Who do I then tell don't come to work? Because you are probably moving around more, and you're going to put these 3 women at risk and their families at risk. But I want these 3 women in my office to help them. So, it's a simple thing at a micro level, but if we can just get this to a much bigger macro level of inclusion requires us to listen and develop programs from the voices of the people that we are trying to include, not from us sitting here. And that's going to be important. I also believe a lot of R&D needs to be done in basically our own thinking and designing of programs, not just, infrastructure. We are always doing R&D on the structural, visible stuff, but on operational frameworks, on what is it that we actually know as institutions and communities about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Do we have policies, thinking in place at the micro level of us as institution, at the macro level with partners, and then beyond that in the communities that we work in? Are we actually doing a lot of R&D to see whether that's there? It's something that actually a lot of organizations got thinking during this pandemic. And why? Because we saw like the differential health impact of the pandemic hit us on our face. When we saw the communities who were being impacted, the death tolls, colored people of, migrants, marginalized, that's when I think a lot of us it's not like it was not there before that. It took a pandemic to hit us on our face and say, wait a minute, there's something we are not doing right here. That R&D needs to be done if you are serious about inclusion. And I think institutions across the board have to start rethinking their program strategies and their funding strategies, both. Seriously.
No, absolutely. Nandita, and I think, firstly, who did the thinking and who did the implementation is a blog title. I'm just going to, borrow from you and put it up there. I think it's a classic way of putting it. But I think the change in the mindset, and also I think we need to start looking at data, to do all of the things that you just said, we need to start really using data as a very important, input to us. I mean, it may not be only data, obviously we need a lot more, than data, but I think that's starting to inform, what the situation is today and how we need to kind of help better it. But really, I think there's a call out for all program designers and philanthropists and, social organizations to say there's an opportunity to rethink design, rethink the way you will do it, rethink, how do all of those, aspects of it. Sundeep, the reason I, kind of, kept you till the end is because I'm going to ask you probably the most difficult question, is the corporate sector, really beyond digital and all of these things, thinking about inclusive development, right? There was obviously, some parts of what we saw was clear that they were probably not, during the pandemic, and probably one of the reasons the pandemic, climate change, all of these things are hitting us in many different ways is really the way, the role of business in society, has to change. And has the pandemic really, taught us that, or is it just a blip in the, is it a band-aid, or are we really, learning from it? And is there a shift in the mindset of corporates?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think let me come to that point in a minute, but I've been intently listening to all the speakers, and I think one thing that has really stood out for me is the breadth of topics that we have touched upon. So we have talked about business model disruptions, we have talked about supply chain disruptions, we have talked about the challenge of access. So for example, Dr. Randeep talked about, do we also have people who have the smartphone access if you're talking about something like telehealthcare? We touched upon topics like micro governance. Should health be a state topic versus a center topic? We have touched upon things like behavioral shifts. We talked about things like cuff etiquettes, for example. A very different challenge with respect to the overall problem that we are talking about. And of course, we have touched upon the challenges with respect to empowerment. How do we ensure that women and some of the marginalized communities are empowered to be able to come to terms? Now, I've been thinking about all of this, and from the lens of corporate, because that's where I can kind of contribute. And if one were to think about how does one start to really address a challenge which has this kind of a breadth, there is of course no one size fits all approach that will work here. There is no one single stakeholder that can address all of this in its entirety. And what I have realized is that there are broadly 3 things that one should be thinking about, and of course corporates have a role to play in that in a very big way. I think the first one is about the physical and digital infrastructure. We talked about things like the capital outlay that has come out in the budget allocation in terms of building out the physical infrastructure. We are aware of all the innovation that is happening in the space of, let's say, digital tech or ed tech or fintech. Just to give you a piece of statistic, there has been a 4x increase in the level of investments in the ed tech sector in the last 1 year vis-a-vis what it was about a year back. So that's a big thing. There has to be an element of soft infrastructure. And when I say soft infrastructure, I'm talking about the policies, the philanthropic ecosystem, all of those good points that we have talked about in terms of really enabling at the grassroots level through the right kind of measures to kind of empower the communities. That's the second thing. And now to the point that you talked about, is the corporate sector doing enough? That's the third big thing. I like to quote one key message that I gathered at Davos a few days back, which was the fact that the corporates need to up their ambition by almost 10x if we were to be able to come back on track to meet the 2030 targets and come back on track because of what has happened in the last 10 to 12 months. Now, that's the level of ambition that needs to increase. And when I'm talking about the level of ambition, really in terms of our commitments to become net zero, our commitments towards the societies that we operate in, our commitment towards communities. And that's where there is a huge opportunity to up the game. A lot of corporates are doing a lot of good stuff, but there is a definitive opportunity to really rethink, reimagine, and reinvent to become more resilient as we move forward. If I were to just quote maybe one example, how is Accenture thinking about it? Because that's what I'm closest to. We have very quickly rehuddled and thought about how are we as a corporate going to respond to this. And we have changed our ambition. We have changed our commitments. So what was initially something like a 2030 or a 2050 target has been pulled back much more significantly. We recently announced that we want to become net zero by 2025. That's an ambitious target, but that's what we are going towards. We have recently defined that by 2023, we need to shift to completely 100% renewable energy powered facilities. Again, it's a stretch target for us, but that's what it takes. And that's the thing that I think we as corporates will need to bring out, really stretch the imagination and get some bold, ambitious commitments, which we then kind of mobilize all our efforts towards to really enable it in a big, scalable way. Back to you.
Absolutely, Sundeep. But I think it's fantastic. I mean, I really love the point that you picked up on from Davos on the 10x bit. I think that's really, I think, where we find ourselves, today. And we've been all saying that this is a decade of action. We have maybe about 8 years to move from climate mitigation to climate adaptation. Or start living underground. I don't know what will happen. But this is really a decade of action, and we need to convert it into a decade of outcomes. If we just act and not get the outcomes and the results, we will be in trouble. So we need to also move from that to decade of outcomes. And I think upping the ambition levels is a great starting point, for all of us to start moving in there. I'm going to just switch gears and start taking some questions. Thanks to the audience, we're getting some good questions. And please keep the questions coming. We have another 10 to 15 minutes probably to address them. Dr. Guleria, the first question is probably I think best answered by you. The question is, how long will the pandemic continue to impact the development of India?
So that's a tough question. The pandemic is there for quite some time. What I can see is that probably the next few months are going to be crucial if we are able to have a good vaccine rollout program, and if our cases continue to be like they are right now, and we don't see a spike which happened like the one which happened in Brazil, then the second half of this year we should be able to say that we are in a much more comfortable position, and we should at least start having a near new normal. COVID will not be zero, but we will be able to really come back in our economy and our functioning with COVID appropriate behavior to a near normal situation. It will take probably another year for us to say that we have really got over the pandemic and everything works all right. The reason why I'm saying it's a tough question is because one of the confounders is how the virus behaves. If the virus mutates and the variant becomes different, it is not going to be the same prediction that I'm giving right now. So presuming that things are good and our vaccines are effective, even with the variation that happens in the virus, the mutation that happens, I think the second half of this year should really see us making good progress. So fingers crossed, and hoping that things continue as they are as far as India is concerned.
Thank you, Dr. Anna. Let's all hope hope for the same. The next question, maybe Roshika, since you said you worked in the education is an important piece that you invest in, and Naghma, maybe you can also jump in after Roshika. Is education as a sector has been disrupted very badly during this during the pandemic. Both from an infrastructure, community, all of those aspects perspective. How do we make education more self-reliant and sustainable, and not have so many disruptions in something so fundamental, as education? Roshika, maybe you first, and then Naghma can come in.
Sure. No, it's a interesting and difficult question in a sense. I mean, I think as I mentioned, the innovation in digital in education will be key, absolutely. And yet we do, as we talk about equity, we do have the problem of equity amongst digital infrastructure, as well as smartphones. And I think that is a challenge. We really have to look at how do we have that last mile delivery of digital technology to enable education. I think that's probably one of the biggest areas that we need to look at and understand that, again, public and private sector have to work together on this. We cannot solve it alone. It's definitely two sides, two hands that need to clap to look at education. I think, children across the world, I mean, I'm a mother of two as well, have really, apart from not having that interactive space, I think have struggled. We've seen health problems. We've seen young children with, even physical back problems and so forth emerge. I mean, this is a new health issue that younger children have had, because I probably started using a computer in my, 20s. They started it when they were 9, 10 or younger. So I think we need to really allow for innovation, the digital space as well. And again, I think be responsible in wearing masks and working towards minimizing the impact of the pandemic so that we can physically get back to schools and secondary tertiary education. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. And I think it's really about partnerships. Naghma, would love to get your response on the same.
So I will build on, and will not repeat what Roshika said, because I 100% agree with her, but building and taking it on from there. Again, another worry I have is that we should not make only digital access the center of all our future plans. Digital access infrastructure has to be a part of a well-thought strategy. And the worry right now is everybody's thinking digital will solve all our problems. All you have to do is get that phone in the child's hand. But we'll have to keep, we'll have to remember what we're talking about here. And the second piece that I would like to say is that funders have to keep at it. We cannot walk away from education, because that was one of the worries that I had. Can you hear me, Krishna? Yeah. So somewhere in the middle, there was also the worry that now that schools are not going on, should we reduce funding from education, start addressing the more critical problems? But I think we are sitting on a critical problem. There are millions of children that are facing disruption of education. So persisting with it is very important. So do not pull out of that. Do not think of digital as the end goal or the magic wand that is going to solve all our problems. I'm a firm believer of recognizing that we will lose learning. The indicators will look poor for some time, and we should. I keep repeating that everywhere. That let's first put it in the center that levels will drop, and then let's start building for it. We cannot negate the fact that there is a struggle. And the last piece, which I feel is very, very critical, is the community's role in ensuring that children study. It takes a village to raise a child. Never been truer now. In pockets where communities have really rallied and worked with schools and school infrastructure to say that children should get at least some kind of facilitation, things have worked better than in places where communities could not do that. So bringing all the problems across board, I feel, is when you put power in the hands of the people will do half the work. And then we have to be smart. So even in education, I think that rule applies, that make communities participate in the solution for education, and let digital be an important part, but not the all of it.
Can I add one point as well? I think even when we talk about education as well, I think again our definition is probably widened. And skill development is an important thing. I think when we look at young graduates now as well, I think to be able to offer entrepreneurship skills to enable them to create or have livelihoods, because now young graduates, I think job opportunities and so forth are different. So I think skill development as well. So when we think of education, think of skill development alongside more traditional curriculums as well.
Brilliant. No, absolutely. And I think broadening the definition of education and making sure that the ownership is, through the value chain and not it's not a push down, more pull up kind of an approach, I think is very, very critical. Thank you both. Sundeep, probably the next question, if I can request you to come in, it talks about how do we get more, private sector, Indian, and I'm probably broadening it to global as well. And especially the middle of the corporate pyramid. The top of the pyramid is already very aligned to SDGs, talking about it in Davos, all that stuff. But how do we get SMB startups to think SDGs, and not just some philanthropy or CSR on the side, but actually think SDGs at the mid and early stages of the companies?
Yeah. Sure. No, I think an important point, because, we have seen a lot of such big, bold commitments from the corporates at the top level, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot needs to happen beneath. And that's where I think an institutional shift is what we require. So it cannot be entrusted or it cannot be mandated. You cannot ask someone to be really driving a CSR agenda or a value creation agenda through the lens of sustainability. What needs to happen is really incentivize, create the right kind of an environment where this thing becomes a way of doing business and not something which we need to do out of an obligation besides doing the business. The moment that shift can come in, it will kind of start seeing the end of the day in terms of really happening in real. That's one. And that's where I think governments can play a very positive enablement role in terms of really calling out the right kind of policy framework to kind of drive it in reality. And the other thing that I feel is very important out here is the whole shift towards ESG, the ESG metrics, the whole definition of success, the whole definition of what good looks like needs to evolve. So for very long, I think the definition of success from corporate's perspective has really been revolving around the top line growth, the bottom line growth, the return to shareholders. And that's a little myopic in terms of what needs to be the real definition. So just the way we talked about broadening the education, the definition of education, I think broadening the definition of what investors value, what corporate success looks like is something that needs to happen over time. And again, it's not something which can happen by design or by one particular stakeholder's intervention. It's a more systemic thing, which is slowly but surely happening because of the changing consumer behaviors, the changing consumer mindsets, the changing investor criteria. So that's what I think it entails to kind of really bring it to life.
Brilliant. And I think the point about, government policy is very critical, but the consumer mindset and the demand from consumer, I think I've seen, been a lot more powerful kind of, measure for people to move. And I think that's something that at a market level, we probably need to kind of start thinking about. Nandita, just extending that question to the social sector itself, how do we get SDGs to become the language across the social sector ecosystem itself? Sometimes we speak to be speaking very different languages within the development ecosystem, and obviously with the CSR law, the Schedule 7 versus SDG to what metric who is following. How do we kind of bring it all together? Because unless we have a common language, it's very hard to partner.
Yeah, thanks, Krishna. I think a couple of things came to my mind as I was listening to both Sundeep and Naghma and Roshika, is that, it's the SDGs have given a common frame of lens. The question is the interpretation. How are we interpreting? And if we go by the belief that the development sector is linear, I think we're making a big mistake. The development sector itself is as diverse and as non-linear as probably the corporate sector or as government in nation states. And I think that probably a synergizing of thinking on what development itself needs to be rejigged for all of us who are in the development sector. What do we mean? I mean, it's the same thing which you want to now use as a blog is who's doing the thinking and who's doing the implementing. And I think if we look at the SDGs and say whether it's health or it's education, which aspect of our investment is going to really be targeted, not based on what is the priority of what is my institutional priority, but what is the priority of the community to whom I'm delivering. Unless we reject that, I think SDGs would remain like what most organizations have it. I mean, we have it printed, put at the back of our annual plans, our strategic plans, but do we really actively act on it to make it? Because in itself, the SDG actually are providing you a platform to really go down to the community and bring that thinking up, not the other way down. And we've been doing the other way down, which has been a challenge. It's something like even taking the discussion you had on education. Universal education for all, yes, we know. And now we have all got excited about digital. Well, it was important and still is important because of what has happened. But education is not just what you're learning on your tablet. It's about behavior. It's about interaction. It's about mixing and mingling with people. It's both about social behavior, social etiquette, learning from one another. And I think if we lose sight of that, then again, we might tomorrow have a society where probably we start investing in putting a tablet in the hand of every child, but lose out on education itself. We may make people literate and aware, but it's much more than that. So I think the development sector also has to do some serious thinking. I also feel that there's a major disconnect, Krishna, between the way the development sector at the national or at the capital level thinks about SDGs versus what the local community groups and CSOs know and understand SDG to be. They take it as something that we are pushing down and getting them to work on. We haven't unpacked it for them to be able to understand it in the context of their reality and where they are. And I think that is a massive amount of work we will have to do as development sector players, and focus our energies on that. I also think what has opened up, and which I feel I think we need to continue to invest in, there has been a greater opening up of wanting to learn from across sectors. So corporate sector, foundations, UN agencies, other development sector players, the ability that now we have come to the point saying that none of us really have the answers, we have to work together, was something that the pandemic did, and I think we should lose sight of that. This is really going to be a cross-learning that we'll have to invest in.
Oh, absolutely, and really getting that right is probably going to be a very important criteria for us to succeed going forward. Because if we are not aligned, then it's hard to kind of really make that happen. The last question, Dr. Guleria, I had to even though we're a little short of time, and I really want to ask this question. It's a good one, saying if we were on a scale of 0 to 10, 0, at the beginning of the pandemic. How ready are we for the next pandemic on a scale of 1 to 10?
Okay, again, an interesting question. Let me put it this way. When if you look back 1 year ago, and we were to look at the same scale, I would say that we were really not prepared for this pandemic. It would have been probably at a very low level. Although having said that, I would really say that a lot of us have been talking about a pandemic for more than 15 years. We had H5N1, which is known as bird flu, way back in 1997-98. And then we had SARS, we had H1N1, we've had MERS, we've had outbreaks of Ebola. I think there have been enough, let's say, signals that a big pandemic is inevitable. So let's say that whatever we've learned, if we carry this forward in terms of aggressive surveillance, in terms of having good collaboration to develop platforms for having vaccines early, let's say within 6 months rather than what we have had this time, to have a good system that we can contain an outbreak in the area that it happens rather than allowing it to spread globally, and develop strategies of where we have partnership not only at a national level but at an international level, both for research, surveillance, and for being able to upscale our healthcare facilities. These are the challenges that we had, and there is protocols and plans in place, but what it needs is the will and the let's say the finances, the sustainability. Because what happens is that whenever we talk of a pandemic, once it's over, and this happened with H1N1 also, our resources get diverted to other areas and we forget about it till the next pandemic. So I hope we've learned our lessons, and we really need to have a sustained development, which is long-term rather than short-term. I think that is the basic message that I'd like to say. But we are better prepared than what we were before, but I won't say that we are in an ideal situation even now for subsequent pandemics.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. But really, I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion for me. It's really a lot of good insights, I think, that we've gotten. And if I were to just briefly summarize, for us to be a self-reliant and sustainable country, we need to make sure that it starts with the individuals. Everybody has to be sustainable. It's almost a unit economics of self-reliance and sustainability model. We need to work at the individual level across communities, across organizations, big, small, everybody has to be self-reliant for us to be self-reliant and sustainable as a country. It can't be just parts of the ecosystem or parts of our communities. That's important, and that's the only way to become self-reliant and sustainable. I think that's a big takeaway from this. And with what I think, Doctor, you started us off saying, we had it in us already to kind of respond to this. We just and this probably brought the capabilities and mindsets to the forefront. We just need to continue that. If we are able to do that and partner well as an ecosystem, a lot of you talked about partnerships, then I think we as India, have the solutions for our own problems and for the rest of the world. And I think that's where we potentially see the opportunities. Really want to thank all of you for your time. It's been wonderful, being part of this. Thank you, UNGCI, for the opportunity. And over to you, Richa. Back to you.
A very informative and engaging session indeed. Thank you, Krishna. I must congratulate you for having led the panel discussion extremely well. And I must thank Dr. Guleria in particular for taking that last question that I had sent in the chat box. Thank you so much. I thank all our panelists for sharing their thoughts, their experience, their insights on some very critical issue. And with this, we come to the end of this morning's session, concurrent session part 2. But before we wind up, I must tell all our participants that we have a very important discussion coming up in the later half of the day, in the evening, on poverty, hunger, and health. So do tune in at 4 p.m. sharp for this. We would love to have you back. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.